How did you know? That's the question that haunts them now. Not in words, but in avoidance. In the stiffness of their posture when you walk into a room. In the way they don't meet your eyes anymore. You didn't shout your strategy. You didn't telegraph your moves. You moved like smoke, untraceable, intangible, but always present. While they plotted loudly, you listened quietly. While they guessed out of insecurity, you watched out of certainty. They underestimated the silence of someone who's seen too much. They thought your distance was confusion, but it was orchestration. They assumed you weren't playing the game, when you were simply playing at a level where their rules no longer mattered. And now reality bends toward the blueprint you never shared. That's the part they can't breathe through. That everything they tried to delay, derail, or destroy is happening. Without them. Because you built the outcome in the places they thought were empty. You planted your victories in obscurity, in moments that didn't look powerful. You made decisions when no one was watching. You sowed transformation in the dark, beneath whispers, beneath the weight of betrayal. And when the tide shifted, when the pieces began falling into place, they didn't see cause, they saw consequence. And because they couldn't trace your methodology, they began fearing your mind. Not your hands, not your voice, your mind. The way it moved without friction, without noise. The way it devoured chaos without being swallowed by it. They used to call your vision delusion. Now they call it fate. They ask themselves, how did they see this coming? But you didn't see it. You knew it. You walked in it before it existed. Because some people need proof to believe. Others just believe and build until the world has no choice but to catch up. They're terrified not because you changed, but because they never really knew you. They never truly listened. They watched your surface, studied your tone, mocked your ideas, but never sat with your silence. And that silence was the operating room where you dissected patterns, motives, betrayals. They thought they were playing chess while you were redesigning the board. And now they're still clinging to strategies you've outgrown. They react in panic while you respond in precision. Because reality no longer moves in random bursts. It moves in echoes of your intention. You crafted a life they can't interrupt. That's what unsettles them. Not that you moved on, but that your absence still bends the room. You don't even need to confront them anymore. Your progress speaks in dialects they don't understand. And that language, that's the sentence they're now serving. What haunts people most is not revenge. It's irrelevance. And you gave them exactly that. You didn't destroy them. You outpaced them. You let their drama expire in its own echo chamber. You didn't demand apologies. You built outcomes that made their assumptions look small. That's where the real power lies, not in tearing others down, but in rising so far above the noise that it no longer finds you. They expected emotional outbursts. You gave them calm execution. They waited for confrontation. You gave them results. You didn't try to prove them wrong. You just made the truth undeniable. That's the power of conviction cloaked in discipline. And that's the nightmare they now live with. Knowing you knew all along and said nothing. Knowing every sarcastic remark, every dismissive gesture, every subtle sabotage was countered not with anger, but with patience. And that patience became the machinery of your rise. They once smirked when you spoke about vision, called it fantasy, laughed at your ambition when it didn't arrive in fireworks. But they misunderstood time. They thought delay meant denial. You knew it meant preparation. You weren't fantasizing. You were forecasting. And while they laughed, you studied. You watched the shifts in behavior. You watched how loyalty frayed when it was no longer convenient. You watched how they mistook kindness for ignorance and silence for approval. You didn't correct them. You let them misread the room. Because your truth didn't require interpretation. It only needed time. And now, time has arrived. It stands beside you like an old friend, validating every instinct you couldn't explain to those who didn't listen. They're not afraid of your success. They're afraid of your accuracy. That every move they mocked now mirrors the very future they cannot escape. The difference between you and them was never intelligence. It was depth. They skimmed the surface of every moment, looking for shortcuts. You dove into the abyss, looking for patterns. You lived the chaos they feared. You let it tear you apart so you could understand it. And from that wreckage, you built something they can't replicate: clarity. Your plans weren't spontaneous. They were sculpted in pain, honed in silence, and protected by patience. You didn't get lucky. You got relentless. And while they mistook your stillness for stagnation, you were becoming the thing they now fear, a force of quiet inevitability. They thought you were passive, but you were simply playing a longer game, the kind of game that ends not in applause, but in their realization that you were always 10 steps ahead, pretending to be behind, just to observe their character. They're terrified because the mask they wore while mocking you has cracked, and they don't know how much you saw. They can't sleep easy knowing that you witnessed their intentions while never letting them know you noticed. That's the haunting, that they mistreated you in front of someone who already knew the final scene, and you didn't stop them. You let them bury themselves in their own theater. They weren't ready for someone who could absorb pain without lashing out. They couldn't comprehend someone who plays for legacy, not attention. And now the fear isn't about your power. It's about your poise. Because anyone who can take that much without breaking has already become untouchable. You've become an enigma wrapped in consequences, and they can't predict your next move because they never saw your first one. Every win you're collecting now echoes through their denial. They hear your name differently. They remember the conversations where they dismissed your ideas, ignored your warnings, laughed at your strategy. And now, that laughter tastes bitter because you didn't argue, you didn't defend, you just watched. And while they spent their energy trying to discredit you, you invested your energy in becoming undeniable. That's what power looks like. It's not about controlling the room. It's about reshaping the room through presence alone. You don't chase redemption. You don't need closure. You walk forward, and the path builds itself in your shadow. They wanted to manage your perception, but now they're trapped in the echo of your intention. Reality follows your design, and they're left wondering, how did you do it? The answer is simple: you stopped performing and started building. You didn't force results. You became the type of person results are drawn to. That shift wasn't aesthetic. It was atomic. You restructured your identity at the cellular level. You trained your spirit to function without applause. You learned to breathe without affirmation. And from that foundation, you built outcomes that can't be undone. They tried to stall your growth by denying you support. But they forgot your growth wasn't dependent. It was intrinsic. And now, the systems they thought would hold you back are irrelevant. Because systems built to suppress can't hold someone who outgrew their blueprint. You didn't just escape the cage. They're still in it, watching, panicking, whispering amongst themselves. How did they know? But you don't answer. You just keep walking, your silence painting realities they can no longer sabotage. They don't fear your potential anymore. They fear your inevitability. You've become the outcome they tried to prevent, the version of you they couldn't calculate. And that version doesn't retaliate. It reigns, quietly, steadily, permanently. You no longer fit in their definitions. You're not angry. You're not bitter. You're simply done. And that completion is louder than any revenge. Their words came fast, loud, and rehearsed. They scribbled narratives across rooms you never entered, sealing opinions with signatures dipped in venom. They spoke like truth was theirs to manufacture, like reputation was paper and their tongues were the press. And you said nothing, not out of weakness, but strategy. While they passed around counterfeit versions of you, you stayed in the shadows, where truth ages slowly and power grows patient. You watched them forge entire personas out of insecurity and jealousy, etching their fiction into the minds of weak listeners. But you didn't interrupt. You didn't scream. You didn't beg for correction. Because the story you were writing didn't require ink. It required time. Their lies echoed, but your silence gathered weight until it became the only thing that couldn't be rewritten. You let them play author because you knew the plot didn't end where they left it. They thought control meant the ability to speak first. But you understood that silence is not submission. It's suspense. You weren't trying to win their game. You were building your own stage, brick by invisible brick, under the noise of their performance. They believed that if they said something enough times, it would become fact. But repetition doesn't create reality. It just delays reckoning. You weren't responding because you were preparing. Every silence was a calculation. Every pause, a paragraph. You weren't trying to prove them wrong. You were simply waiting until the world caught up with the truth you already knew. And when it did, their ink-stained illusions crumbled beneath the gravity of a presence they never saw coming. They wrote with arrogance, believing no one would question their version of you. Their words were laced with subtle sabotage, just enough doubt to stain, just enough charm to be believed. But ink fades. Truth doesn't. While they performed their fiction, you embodied your reality. You didn't ask for vindication. You became it. And what unsettled them most was not that you came back, but that you never needed to. You were always there, waiting, transforming. They wanted to bury you with narrative. You built a throne from that burial ground. That's what made your silence terrifying. It didn't defend, it declared. And now, their stories feel hollow, childish, out of place in the presence of someone who never had to lie to become legendary. You didn't retaliate with stories. You retaliated with results. They tried to paint your character, but character doesn't bleed from gossip. It reveals itself in endurance. You let them circulate their fiction like currency, while you built wealth in authenticity. And when your moment came, you didn't bring receipts. You brought outcomes. Their chapters folded under the weight of your reality, because while they were busy scripting the downfall of someone they never understood, you were writing legacy in the language of action. They thought storytelling would control perception, but you wrote something deeper, not for readers, for witnesses. You didn't craft words to defend yourself. You shaped events that left no room for their narrative to survive. And now, the silence they mocked has become scripture in rooms they no longer get invited into. The real sting. You let them think they won. You didn't challenge their accusations. You let them decorate themselves with premature victory. Because you knew what they didn't, that real power doesn't speak to shallow ears. It waits. It allows falsehoods to rot in their own echo chamber. You let them perform their character assassination so completely, so confidently, that they left no room for reversal. And when your reality surfaced, it buried theirs without you saying a word. That's what haunts them now. Not just that they were wrong, but that they said it so loudly, so often, with such certainty. And now, in the presence of your quiet reign, they don't just look mistaken, they look fraudulent. That's the cost of writing in ink, without knowing the plot was never theirs to control. You weren't interested in public relations. You were focused on private revolutions. They had followers. You had conviction. And conviction doesn't market itself. It doesn't post clarifications. It transforms, slowly, without permission. And while they chased applause with headlines, you built depth in the dark. They saw platforms. You saw foundations. They had eyes. You had foresight. And that foresight told you not to interrupt them while they self-destructed in prose. So you waited. You didn't shout your truth, you became it. You walked it into every room. And when people looked at you, they felt something they couldn't explain. That's how you erase a lie. Not by arguing it, but by outliving it. They used words like weapons, but yours were forged in silence. That silence wasn't emptiness. It was concentration. While they scattered energy into gossip, you condensed yours into evolution. They underestimated how dangerous someone becomes when they stop explaining. Because words can be argued, but presence cannot be debated. And when you showed up, whole, unbroken, untouchable, their pages turned to ash. Because no one needed to hear your side anymore. They could see it. They could feel it. And what they felt contradicted every sentence written against you. That contradiction doesn't scream, it lingers. And that lingering is the shadow they now live in. They never imagined their story would collapse without confrontation. They expected a war of narratives. But you gave them no battlefield. You built your empire on a different plane, one that doesn't need to answer to ink or echo. They keep rereading their script, trying to find the moment you destroyed them. They won't find it, because your destruction wasn't theatrical. It was surgical. They died by exposure, by contrast, by the sheer weight of your authenticity. You didn't out-talk them. You outlived the need to. That's the kind of revenge that can't be undone, the kind that doesn't knock, just replaces. They mistook the beginning for the ending, mistook your stumble for your surrender, mistook your stillness for your fall. They laughed in the hallway, laughed at the rumors they helped ignite, laughed behind screens and in circles made of cowardice. You heard it. You heard the ridicule disguised as advice. You heard the sarcasm drip from their tongues like they were pouring acid onto your name, believing you were too fragile to survive it. They thought the mockery would be the soundtrack to your burial. They had no idea it would become the overture to your coronation. That laughter, premature, arrogant, loud, echoes now through empty halls where your name can no longer be erased. They laughed at a story they didn't understand, assuming they knew the final chapter. But they never read the prologue right. And now, the irony has turned on them like a beast they summoned but could not control. They laughed because they believed control belonged to those who spoke first, because they confused performance with dominance. But control doesn't come from noise. It comes from knowledge. And you knew. You knew their applause was artificial. You knew their smiles were rehearsed. So you let them laugh. You didn't defend yourself, didn't correct the narrative, didn't join their theater. You watched. You tracked. You calculated. You understood the psychology of insecure people clinging to shared illusions. They were betting against your rise, all while you were becoming the storm that would outlive their words. You didn't interrupt. You evolved. You let their laughter build, let it echo into arrogance, let it bake into permanence, so that when it shattered, the silence would be deafening. And now, that silence follows them everywhere. The irony, they needed you to fail. Needed it more than they ever needed your success, because your failure was the only thing that validated their choices. Your collapse would have comforted them. But your survival, that exposed their stagnation. They were laughing, not because you were weak, but because they were terrified that you might be strong and quiet about it. That maybe, just maybe, you weren't out of the game, you were just out of their reach, and now they see it. Now it's too late. Because your ascent wasn't dramatic. It was undeniable. You didn't rise with trumpets. You rose like a tide, and tides don't ask permission. They just erase whatever stood too close to the edge when the waters changed. They laughed too soon, and now they can't stop replaying the footage of it in their minds. How confident they were. How smug. How certain they were that you were finished. And now, they're choking on the memory of their own jokes. Because every achievement you collect, every room you command, every outcome you own, it mocks them. Not through words, but through contrast. You didn't have to say anything. You became everything they claimed you couldn't. And now the laughter they once shared is rotting in their throats. That's how irony works. It waits. It doesn't swing with fury. It pierces with elegance. And you, without lifting a single finger, have become the living embodiment of their miscalculation. They gathered like critics on opening night, ready to review a tragedy they hadn't written. But the tragedy never came. You didn't break. You didn't fall apart. You disappeared into your own process and emerged unrecognizable. While they grew addicted to their own opinions, you grew roots. They laughed at what they thought was a fall, but what they saw was a rebirth, and rebirth doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives. That's the twist they never planned for, that you weren't healing in public. You were sharpening in private, and the version of you they mocked. That version was just the molting, the discarded skin. The real you was always underneath, watching, waiting. And now you've arrived, not for revenge, but as proof that laughter doesn't change the outcome. It just marks who failed to see it coming. They believed the power was in the moment. You knew the power was in momentum. You didn't need to fight every slight, didn't need to clap back at every dig. You were busy outgrowing the narrative. And when people asked what happened to you, they couldn't find the punchline. Because you didn't collapse, you just recalibrated. You realigned your soul while they misjudged your silence. And now, the irony is this: they've said so much about you that none of it matters, because reality has replaced the rumor. Presence has replaced the speculation. You walk in, and the air shifts, not because of revenge, but because of rebirth. You're not loud. You're undeniable. And their laughter is now the sound of their own irrelevance ringing in their ears. The best kind of silence is the one that lets people fall into the holes they dug for others. That's what you gave them. A silence that looked like surrender, but was actually structure. Every time they laughed, you laid another brick. Every time they gloated, you adjusted the angle, until the foundation beneath you could carry what they couldn't even envision. You weren't chasing revenge. You were chasing mastery. And now, they find themselves dwarfed by the very thing they said you'd never become. That's the kind of irony that doesn't just sting, it devours. Because it proves they never had you figured out. Not even close. They were analyzing a mask. You were building an empire behind it. You didn't need to correct them. Life did it for you. Life has a poetic sense of justice. It doesn't rush. It lets the delusion spread. It lets the arrogance rot into confidence. Then it delivers the truth, not with drama, but with finality. You walking into your purpose was that truth. And their laughter, once so sharp, so cruel, now echoes like a warning to everyone who watched. A warning that some people build in the shadows, that some people weaponize doubt, that some people turn humiliation into fuel. You did that quietly, elegantly, brutally. And now they look back and realize they weren't laughing at you. They were laughing at their own ignorance. Now they watch you through the glass of their own distance. They don't reach out. They can't. Because contact would mean confronting the fact that everything they joked about became irrelevant. You didn't need to prove them wrong. You let time do the talking. That's what makes the irony unbearable, that they laughed early, loudly, publicly, and now their silence is just as loud, because they know, and worse, they know you know. They see it in your composure. They hear it in your stillness. They feel it in the rooms you now own. You are not angry. You are not bitter. You are beyond them. And the only sound they're left with is the laughter they once weaponized, now bouncing off the walls as a requiem for their credibility. That's their fuel, your reaction, your confusion, your outrage. The moment you engage, they feast. Not on truth, not on resolution, but on chaos. They aren't seeking solutions. They crave disruption because stillness threatens them. Peace exposes their irrelevance. So they bait you. They pull you into arguments that loop, contradictions that stack, accusations that shift like shadows. Always moving, never settling. They don't fight fair. They don't fight to understand. They fight to consume your clarity and twist it into a script where they're the misunderstood hero and you're the unstable one. But you've seen the cycle. You've watched how their rage isn't sparked by harm. It's sparked by your refusal to be controlled. The more calm you are, the more dangerous you become. Because the moment you stop reacting, their empire collapses. They have nothing to feed on, and a predator with no prey starves. They don't just want you upset. They want you visible in your upset. They want the performance, the emotional spectacle, the proof they can use against you later. They provoke you with daggers wrapped in passive aggression, knowing that if you swing first, they'll get to play the wounded. They thrive in chaos because it distracts from their hollowness. Every dramatic eruption is a mask, a desperate attempt to maintain control in a room where your composure threatens to make them irrelevant. So what do? You become the one thing they cannot digest: indifference. You starve them of energy, of rebuttals, of access. You offer silence where they expect war, and in that silence they wither, because toxic people don't know how to exist without conflict. They suffocate in peace. You don't have to destroy them. You just have to disappear from the circus they can't survive without.